I was asked to give a talk at the Agronomy Research Update in Saskatoon on December 10th, 2019. I thought I'd turn the presentation into a short little video. Basically, the talk is about getting the most out of nitrogen. I was asked originally to talk about broadcast applications of urea to snow, but I've also incorporated a lot more into this talk because there's just so much to talk about in regards to nitrogen. First of all, there's two forms of nitrogen that plants will take up. There's the ammonium form and the nitrate form. The ammonium form is prone to losses, such as volatilization, because the ammonium form can convert to ammonia gas and then dissipate into the air. If the ammonium form is incorporated into the ground with adequate rainfall, it's now free of volatilization losses, but it can be converted into nitrate. And once it's in the nitrate form, it will move in the soil. So it could be lost to leaching, or it could be lost to denitrification, which is basically a process where soil microbes use up the nitrate as an oxygen source when soils are waterlogged and anaerobic. So to combat these losses, we come up with the 4 R's of nitrogen management. We have the right rate, don't put down more than you need. The right time, put it down as close to when the crop needs to use it as possible. The right place, preferably under the ground to protect it from volatilization losses. And if you have to throw it on the soil surface, use the right form, such as Super U or Agrotane, that can protect the urea from such losses. So I'm going to talk about applying nitrogen early in the season for increasing yield, but then also late season applications which are targeted not for yield increase but for increasing protein. The relationship between yield and protein as nitrogen rates are increasing is quite interesting. At the beginning, you may actually decrease your protein with added nitrogen because you're increasing yield so quickly that the protein is becoming diluted. However, as the yield response declines, the protein starts to shoot up. Eventually, after you've put down too much nitrogen, you'll find that yield may decline, and then eventually protein will level out. Producers are interested in high protein grain because often the industry will offer premiums for high protein wheat. And producers, if they're left with low protein grain, may be wondering what they could have done different to increase their protein. You'll note here that the time at which yield levels off and the time at which protein levels off occur at different times. This creates an opportunity for producers to increase protein in their grain. But of course, as we all know, the environment impacts the amount of protein we get. If we have a drought and we have poor yields, we're likely going to have high protein. If we have a great season, we've got a bumper crop out there, we may find we've got low protein piebald grain. But what about a year where we have low protein and we had low precipitation? What happened then? Well, in some years we do have low precipitation, but we have good soil moisture reserves. And so we still end up with good yields due to adequate moisture and also low levels of disease. Anything that increases your yield is going to decrease your protein. But the other kicker here is that the soil surface is dry and the organic matter is not mineralizing to release nitrogen. So there's a double whammy in those years. We can also think of other ways to increase protein. We're not totally helpless to environmental effects, but they may not be that strong. For example, we could use a higher protein variety. However, a higher protein variety does tend to have lower yields. We could grow wheat on manured fields. That works well, but manured fields aren't everywhere. It's not like it's an option for everybody, and it's certainly not an option for every field. We could grow wheat after a legume, such as peas, for example. But peas have lost favor with producers because we've had problems with root rot diseases, such as Aphanomyces. Faba beans, that's a good option too, but there's a limited market opportunity for them. What about sulfur? Aren't there 2 amino acids that contain sulfur? Well, that's true, but the way that protein is measured in wheat is based on the percent nitrogen content in it. So studies such as Regas here that looked at increasing sulfur rates found that as the way that protein is currently measured had little effect on your protein level. So added sulfur really isn't the solution as well. Basically, anything that increases your yield, and it's not as a result of increasing nitrogen rates, is going to lower your protein. For an example, we had a manipulator trial, plant growth regulator trial, where the wheat was going down early in the year, and the manipulator kept the wheat standing for most of the fall, and this increased our yields by about 10 bushels, but decreased our protein by about 1%. It's just an example. So, what other options do we have? Well, we could consider late season applications of nitrogen. And you could consider a dribble band application of UAN, which is a good choice over broadcast applications of urea, because they're less prone to volatilization. UAN, a quarter of the nitrogen in there is nitrate. That's not prone to volatilization. And also, a concentrated band of UAN does not increase the pH like a concentrated band of urea or a granule of urea does. When you increase the pH, you favor the production of ammonia gas, and you could lose it to the air. Broadcast foliar spray applications of UAN are also an option. This is popular in the northern United States. John Hurd calls this North Dakota recipe the 7-10-20-30 rule. Basically, you're trying to spray 7 days after anthesis with 10 gallons per acre of 2800, that's the UAN, and cut it in half with 10 gallons per acre of water. This will form a solution of about 14% nitrogen. You're supposed to spray at below 20 degrees Celsius when it's cooler, and this all will apply 30 pounds of nitrogen per acre. This approach can result in leaf burn though, and if you're increasing your protein by decreasing your yield, that's counterproductive. Research has shown that most of the foliar applied nitrogen anyway is actually coming up through the roots. Only 5 to 10% of it is actually entering through the leaf. What needs to happen is for the nitrogen to be washed off the leaves into the soil and then taken up through the plant roots. If soil conditions are dry, I guess there is some benefit to the foliar application because some of that nitrogen will at least end up in the plant. Broadcast applications of melted urea might be an option because we've seen that they are actually burning the leaves to a lesser extent than UAN. So, what has past research found regarding late season application of nitrogen for increasing grain protein? Let's start with Ross Mackenzie. From 1998 to the year 2000, he had 26 site years that were conducted across Alberta and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Most of it was in Alberta. The rates of nitrogen weren't that high, which I guess is sort of a reflection of the time this was conducted, but they looked at 15 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare to a base rate of 60 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And they looked at ammonium nitrate and foliar applications of UAN. Ammonium nitrate's not available anymore. It is a great product for this because the ammonium nitrate is not susceptible to volatilization. However, you can make explosives from it. So we don't have it anymore. Anyway, he looked at those nitrogen rates applied at the tillering, boot stage, and post-anthesis. Overall, they found an average of about a 0.3% increase in protein with a maximum of 1.3% increase. The later applications did increase protein more, but none of the applications really improved protein over just putting that extra nitrogen down at seeding. In the end, the grain protein increases were not economic at most sites. So, Ross concluded, in-crop applications are less reliable than applying additional nitrogen fertilizer at or before seeding. Kind of harsh. So, then John Hurd, he had a look at it, but he worked with some producers. He worked with 15 producers across a variety of different classes of wheat. And the base rate of nitrogen for the CNHR wheat varieties was 120 pounds per acre, and 82 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre were applied for the CWRS varieties. To all these nitrogen rates, 30 pounds of nitrogen was applied as UAN post-anthesis. On average, they increased protein by 0.5%, and this was significant at 9 out of 15 of the sites. When they observed about 8 to 15% leaf burn, this didn't seem to impact yield, but they did have one case where somebody got 30% leaf burn and lost 6 bushels because they applied midday when it was hot. Economically, in the end, only 2 of the 15 sites had a positive economic return. So what have we seen? Well, we conducted an experiment looking at late season applications of nitrogen on wheat at 7 AgriArm sites in 2018. The data that you're seeing now is averaged over those 7 locations. The blue bars represent the yield and the orange bars represent the protein. When we increase the side-banded urea from 70 to 100 pounds of actual nitrogen per acre, we increase yield by about 4 bushels and we increase protein by about 1%. Then we looked at post-seeding applications of nitrogen. So we looked at 30 pounds added to that base rate of 70 pounds of side-banded urea, actual nitrogen. And we did find that we could increase protein by about 0.8% on average. The best treatment was looking at a foliar spray of UAN post-anthesis. The treatments that didn't work quite as well was the dribble-banded applications of UAN either pre-boot or post-anthesis. But you'll note that none of these are better than if we just put that extra 30 pounds down at seeding. We got more yield and we got more protein by using that approach. So this is very similar to the results that Ross Mackenzie found back in the year of 2000. We also conducted this same experiment at these locations to a base rate of 100 pounds. And the biggest difference here was that instead of getting an average protein increase of 0.8%, we got an average protein increase of about 0.6%. And basically that's because there's just more nitrogen in the system and you start coming to a point of diminishing returns. But the results were pretty much exactly the same as when we applied nitrogen to a base rate of 70. But what about dissolved urea, which is often referred to as melted urea? Amy Mangan with the University of Manitoba has compared UAN and dissolved urea and has found the dissolved urea is providing greater yields and greater proteins. But she also found that the dissolved urea did produce a lot less leaf burn than the UAN. But in her comparisons, the UAN was at a 14% solution of nitrogen and the urea was at 9%. So she wasn't really comparing apples to apples. The other thing about dissolved urea is that it's endothermic. So if you're taking water out of a well, you might end up freezing the lines. Another important consideration is that the urea that you dissolve should have less than 1% biuret in it. Otherwise, you'll really burn the crop. Fortunately, most of North American production meets these standards. So we conducted a similar experiment again in 2019, only this time we incorporated some dissolved urea treatments into it. These results here, again the blue bar is the yield, the orange is the protein, are averaged over 6 of the locations, because I'm still waiting on 2 of the locations to give me their data. You guys know who you are. Anyway, this table doesn't exactly represent every site because there were interactions between the sites. But for the first 4 treatments, things were pretty similar between the 6 sites. Increasing side-banded urea from 70 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre, insignificantly increased yield, and even more so insignificantly increased protein. But when we did some dribble band applications at the boot stage, we found that the concentrated application of urea at 20% nitrogen significantly increased protein. For some reason, the dilute UAN at 14% nitrogen when dribble banded did not increase protein. And I'm not sure why, but this effect also was apparent later on in the year. Again, when dribble banded post-anthesis, we got much more protein, when the product was concentrated at 28% nitrogen than when it was diluted at 14% nitrogen. Perhaps there was more volatilization with the diluted nitrogen, but I don't know if this is something we would expect, and I'm still looking into it. Nevertheless, there was a significant difference there, particularly at 3 of the 6 locations. When we looked at post-anthesis applications of UAN, either dribble-banded or foliar applied, versus urea, either dribble-banded or foliar applied, we found that the urea solution actually tended to produce less protein. It certainly wasn't like this at every site, but it was particularly apparent at Outlook. You can see there's some pretty significant protein losses here from having used the dissolved urea over the UAN. What would be the reason for this? Well, I think mostly the reason might be there were more volatilization losses with the urea. If you recall, the UAN, a quarter of it is nitrate. It's not going to be lost to volatilization. Also, it's not increasing the pH in a concentrated band like the urea is, which is encouraging the production of ammonia gas, which can be lost to the environment. So it's probably a difference in volatilization losses between the 2 products that is responsible for these protein differences when they show up. We did see that the urea was safer on the crop, though, than the UAN, whether it was dribble-banded or foliarly applied. The thing is, if the urea was safer on the crop, yeah, that might increase yields and decrease proteins relative to the UAN, but we didn't see any evidence of this. If you look at Outlook here, anything that's got urea on it is not producing higher yields. So that's not the reason. It's probably likely the difference in volatilization losses. Now, as I said, not all sites were the same. Look at IHARF here. Look at the last 2 treatments there. Look how high the protein is with their post-anthesis foliar applications of either urea or UAN. It's through the roof, much higher than even putting all your nitrogen down at seeding. But have a look at the yields here. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have 53 bushels and 15.9% protein wheat by putting all your nitrogen down, 100 pounds of nitrogen in the sideband? Or would you rather lose about 8 bushels and gain 1% protein by doing a foliar application late in the year? So, some conclusions at this point. Wheat grain protein, it can be increased with late season applications of nitrogen, and we typically see responses between 0.5 to 1%. But it's not often better than just putting all that nitrogen down at seeding. If you're increasing your protein as a result of decreasing yield, then it likely wasn't worth it. Melted urea, yeah, it did seem to cause less leaf burn at a number of sites, but we really couldn't detect any benefit from using the melted urea over UAN. So how is this working out economically? Okay, these 2 tables help to answer that question. The tables are based on assuming a protein spread in the market of 66 cents for every % per bushel. If we look at let's say we have a wheat crop that's 60 bushels, and we got a 0.5% increase in protein from putting 30 pounds of nitrogen down late in the season. And let's say our nitrogen costs 50 cents a pound, and if we also include the cost of application in there, we need a spread of 67 cents to break even. So in this scenario, we've broken even. Now, if you're feeling lucky and you think you can get a % increase from doing the practice, then you only need a 33% spread, and you might make some money. But remember, in a lot of cases, just putting all that nitrogen down at seeding will do just as well. So, in other words, I don't think late season applications of nitrogen is something you should plan to do on purpose. It's better to put all the nitrogen down at seeding. However, there'll be the occasion where you've got this great crop coming and you've like, well, you know, I really don't think I fertilized for this high yield. And maybe there's some opportunity to make some protein with a late season application of nitrogen in that case. You know, there are cases where protein in wheat can be so low that the grain handling facilities don't even want it. But you're going to have to weigh the risks of burning your crop in the process, though. Okay, so let's now talk about what I was supposed to talk about at this event. This trial came about from our producers sitting around at the ECRF board wondering about all this nitrogen fertilizer that's being broadcasted on snow. Is that a good thing? After all, they've banned it in Manitoba, haven't they? So what we looked at was different timings of fall application of urea and Super U. We looked at early fall, which was October 2nd, which is too early. We looked at late fall, which is October 27th, which is the ideal time. We looked at early winter on 10 centimeters of snow, which was on November 5th. The early fall application is too early because it is on warm soil and it provides all kinds of time for that urea to be converted into nitrate, and then it's prone to leaching and denitrification losses. Whereas broadcasting on snow is too late because the ground is frozen underneath, and then when the snow is melting later on, you just have this great environment for volatilization as well. So we compared these timings to banded urea checks. We banded urea late fall on October 27th. That's my poor man's example of banding anhydrous. But our better check is the side banding at seeding. Now, the other thing to note is that each one of these treatments that I'm about to show you has received the exact same amount of nitrogen. It's about 174 pounds of urea per acre. So this is what the field looked like when I was broadcasting the fertilizer in the cold by myself. And here are the results. Again, blue is the yield, orange is the protein. You'll note here on the far side our check, the spring side banded urea at seeding, has provided us with by far the highest yields and the highest protein levels. One of the worst treatments was the early fall broadcasting of urea. We've lost 20 bushels of wheat and we've lost 1.5% in protein from having done this. We did reduce our losses by using Super U. We've increased yields and increased protein. So we've lost some volatilization and potentially denitrification losses. If we compare the two broadcast ureas from the early fall and the late fall timing, you can see the late fall timing has given us a better result. That is the ideal time to be broadcasting your fertilizer if you have to do it. We've got more yield, more protein. And again, we improved the situation with adding Super U. But Super U did not provide as big of a difference at this stage as it did at the early fall timing. If you compare it to our late fall banded urea check, there isn't too much difference there. But our late fall banded urea check is still worse than our side banding at seeding check, even though we should not have lost anything to volatilization when we banded it in the fall. When you broadcast urea in early winter on top of snow, we ended up with a very poor result. We have very low yield and very low protein, so we lost a lot of nitrogen by having done this. And using Super U at this time did us no favors at all. So, how did this work out economically? Well, my economics that I'm going to show you are based on a really good protein spread that's listed here, and a spread, quite a wide spread between urea and Super U. I've been criticized in the past that, wow, that spread between the two products is too wide. It's over $200 and typically the spread is $135. But I'm still using it because that's what the local grain elevator quoted me, and we're just going to go with that. And if anything, just think that Super U, it'll look good in what I'm about to show you, and it would look even better if you just have $135 per ton spread. So by far the most economical thing to do was to put all your nitrogen down in the sideband at seeding. Broadcasting urea too early in fall provided much less economic return, but the use of Super U did improve the economic situation. It also improved the economic situation when we broadcasted at the ideal time, and of course we got more money from having waited until then to broadcast the urea. And broadcasting on snow was not a very good economic situation, and Super U did nothing to increase our returns at that time. So if you can't do the right thing, then try to cut the risks. If you can't sideband at seeding and you need to apply that fertilizer in the fall due to logistics reasons, to speed yourself up in seeding the next fall, then try to cut your risks by at least getting the timing and fall right and using a product to protect you from volatilization and denitrification losses.